One of the big questions ahead of this historic summit between the president and North Korean leader Kim Jong Un is how they will communicate. President Trump attempting to secure a deal for full denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Joining us right now is psychologist and behaviorist Dr. Barry Goodfield, who's profiled notorious dictators, including Saddam Hussein. Dr. Goodfield, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Very pleasure to be here. I just need to say something right up front. Everything that we see and say and do is based on observable, testable, referential behavior. In other words, this isn't just a guess about what he will feel, what he will say. It's something based on what we actually see. What
we see from his body language.
Exactly.
And you stress that Kim must be respected from that body language. Tell us about it.
It's totally true that this young man basically has one goal, is to be respected on the world stage. And the one thing that's important for us to realize is that respect is something that the president can offer when he sees something that he trusts and believes in. The wonderful thing about having President Donald J. Trump in this room with this young man across from him, who's looking at a guy, by the way, who has done more negotiations than the days that this man's been on the earth. So this is nothing new for President Trump. He knows exactly what to do and what he wants.
You know, one of the things that the president is very unpredictable, right? I think one of the things that people like about him is the fact that he's not very predictable in his behavior and that he's going to be authentic in who he is. What are you looking for in the president as far as body language and what you expect him to, you expect him to engage?
Well, one of the things you can know about the president is when he looks at you, he's looking at you. I mean, you can't sit across from this man and not realize that there's somebody who's really watching, listening, and thinking every moment about what you're doing. He's ahead of the game in most all cases. And so what we're looking for with him is the idea of him doing exactly what he's done for all these years of his life. So the art of the deal is not just a title, it's a way of looking at life.
You say goodwill is going to win out over good judgment in these negotiations. What does that mean? That failure is not an option for either man? How do you draw this conclusion?
Based on the fact that both of these people are not going there to lose. Both of these people are going there with a lot of baggage. The baggage has got to do with how they're seen and how they come across. With Kim Jong Un, what you have there is a man who's carrying the father whispering and the grandfather whispering in his ear saying, don't trust anybody from the West. Yeah, this is exactly what's happening. So these guys are not trusting anybody. And so what he needs to do is to stand on his own and to look at the man who's right across the table from him and to realize that being tough and being arbitrary and being, in that sense, kind of irrational is not going to do anything to bring him closer to what he needs. This is nothing more, Maria, than a game where you have somebody bringing weapons to the table and somebody at the other end with a cash register willing to give them money. But the president's not offering money. What he's offering is, and what he's demanding, in fact, is you will get rid of those missiles. He's not kidding when he says this, and he will walk away. He's a strong, clear thinker, and he will walk away if it's necessary, and his nonverbal behavior shows that. And I believe that Kim is smart enough to know that.
Dr. Goodfield, Mitch Rochelle here. One of the things you said earlier was that he wants respect. And if he's viewed by his own people around the world stage as capitulating, will that be a bit of a trigger in that he feels as though he's been disrespected and he'll want more, perhaps, than just capitulating?
Well, I think that he will basically want to have people believe and see him as an individual who has got something for what he brought to the table. He's got to walk away with the idea that he's gained respect in exchange for those weapons that are at the other end of the table, which are going to be melted down or whatever the heck they're going to be done with them. He wants to make sure that he's going to walk away saying, look what I did. He has to go back to North Korea and face the people and also people who support him and say, I was victorious because I didn't outsmart this man. I simply put forward a position that he could understand and he could go with. He knows that President Trump is not going to back down.
But Dr. Goodfield, it's Dagan McDowell.
Yes.
But rather than his own people, is Kim Jong Un more concerned with the world stage? Again, he's gone from being a pariah to having a role on the world stage. He's met with the leaders of China and South Korea, the President of the United States. He's got meetings lined up with Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
Well, look, don't anybody kid themselves. This guy is what you think he probably is. I mean, he is not a nice guy. And he is the kind of guy that victory for him is when he gets his way. And when he walks away from the table, in the old days, people somehow that were at the table are never seen again. With Donald Trump, the worst he can say is, "You're fired."
Well,
but Trump is going to say,
that's the thing. I mean, he wants respect, and yet he's a bad guy.
Exactly.
You're saying, but we're supposed to respect him.
Well, he wants respect, but the fact of the matter is his behavior is going to be such that the respect he's going to get is the handshake and the standing together with the two of them smiling, maybe Dennis Rodman in the middle, who knows. But the fact of the matter is standing there smiling and saying, "We're making a deal." And the deal ultimately has got to do with him walking back and getting food and various other things that this starving population that he's in fact responsible for starving.
Well, why do you think
is going to get some kind of change?
Why do you think Kim Jong Un has agreed to do this? I mean, what does he care about his people? What does he care about human rights? Why did he agree to this? Is he afraid he's going to be threatened in terms of his own leadership, him taken out?
Well, of course, that's a very good question, because one of the things that he fears most is some sort of coup d'etat or some sort of assassination. So those things are always in the front of his mind, and he's always doing whatever he can to protect himself, and he will do just that. But what is he afraid of? What I think he's ultimately afraid of is the fact that this opportunity is a one-time deal, and it is a one-time deal, and he needs to understand that.
All right, we will leave it there. Dr. Barry Goodfield, good to see you, sir. Thank you for weighing in this morning.